Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the dimly lit world of Victorian medicine cabinets, where small brown bottles lined mahogany shelves in almost every respectable household across England. These bottles, unremarkable in their appearance, contained a substance that would accidentally revolutionize our understanding of sleep, even as it destroyed countless lives in the process. Laudanum. The word itself sounds like it should mean something medicinal, something trustworthy. It comes from the Latin laudare, meaning to praise, and praised it certainly was throughout the 19th century. This tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, typically about 10% opium by weight, sat alongside the tea canisters and sugar bowls in homes from Mayfair to Manchester. A housewife might reach for it as casually as she would reach for vanilla extract while baking. The typical Victorian laudanum bottle held approximately 4 ounces of liquid. The glass was brown to protect the contents from light degradation, with a cork stopper that would often stain dark from the reddish-brown liquid inside. Most reputable pharmacists labeled their bottles with elaborate typography, listing the ingredients with a kind of pharmaceutical pride. Tincture of opium, prepared according to the London Pharmacopoeia. Some bottles bore warnings, though these were inconsistent and often unhelpfully vague. Not to be taken in large quantities, one might read, without specifying what constituted a large quantity. By the 1850s, Britain was importing roughly 95 tons of raw opium annually, much of it destined for laudanum production. To put this in perspective, consider that a single grain of opium, about 65 milligrams, was considered a standard dose. Those 95 tons represented approximately 1.5 billion doses flowing through the country each year, for a population of roughly 20 million people. The mathematics of this consumption pattern reveals a society thoroughly saturated with opiate use. The cost of laudanum made it democratically accessible in a way that many medicines were not. In 1850, a small bottle could be purchased for 6pence, roughly equivalent to the price of a loaf of bread. For working-class families struggling with the ailments that accompanied industrial life, this affordability was crucial. A factory worker suffering from a persistent cough, a mother dealing with teething infants, an elderly person plagued by joint pain, all could afford this universal remedy. Pharmacists kept careful ledgers of their laudanum sales, and these ledgers, where they survive, tell fascinating stories. The daybook of Thomas Farrow, a pharmacist in Leeds, records his transactions for the year 1847 with meticulous precision. On January 4th, he sold laudanum to Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley, 1 ounce 6pence. On January 5th to Mr. James Cooper, 2 ounces 1 shilling. On January 6th to Mrs. Hartley again, 1 ounce. The pattern repeats throughout the year. Mrs. Hartley's name appears in the ledger 212 times in 12 months, each entry representing a small brown bottle, each bottle representing roughly 1 week's supply if taken at the recommended dose for sleep. But what exactly were people like Mrs. Hartley experiencing when they took their nightly dose of laudanum for insomnia? The physiological effects were complex and, at the time, barely understood. Modern sleep science has allowed us to reconstruct what was happening in the brains and bodies of these Victorian insomniacs, and the picture that emerges is both fascinating and troubling. When Mrs. Hartley measured out her evening dose, perhaps 25 drops in a small glass of water, as was commonly recommended, she was consuming approximately 1 grain of opium. This grain contained several alkaloids, the most significant being morphine, codeine, and thebaine. The morphine, making up about 10% of the opium content, would be absorbed through her digestive system within 30 to 45 minutes. The morphine molecules would cross the blood-brain barrier and bind to mu-opioid receptors throughout her central nervous system. These receptors, we now know, are involved in pain perception, mood regulation, and crucially the sleep-wake cycle. The binding of morphine to these receptors would trigger a cascade of neurological effects. The locus coeruleus, a region of the brainstem that produces norepinephrine and helps maintain wakefulness, would become suppressed. The ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, which promotes sleep, would become more active. What Mrs. Hartley would have experienced subjectively was a gentle warmth spreading through her body, a softening of the sharp edges of daily anxiety, and a growing heaviness in her limbs. The racing thoughts that had kept her awake, worries about her husband's health, concerns about household finances, the persistent noise from the street, would begin to recede. Within an hour she would typically be asleep. The Victorian medical establishment documented these effects extensively, though without understanding the underlying mechanisms. Dr. Thomas Walkley, founder of the Lancet Medical Journal, published numerous case studies of laudanum used for insomnia throughout the 1840s. One particular case, that of a 37-year-old merchant named Mr. H., provides typical detail. Mr. H. had suffered from insomnia for 6 years, sleeping no more than 3 hours per night. He tried various remedies: cold baths, vigorous exercise, dietary restrictions, bleeding. Nothing provided relief. Finally, his physician prescribed 20 drops of laudanum each evening. Mr. H. reported sleeping 7 hours that first night, and continued to sleep well for the following 3 months, documented in the study. But here was the problem that Victorian doctors began to notice with increasing alarm. The remedies stopped working. Mr. H's case study continues. After 3 months, he found himself lying awake again despite the laudanum. His doctor increased the dose to 30 drops. This worked for 6 weeks, then 40 drops, then 50. By the end of the year, Mr. H. was taking 90 drops each night, more than triple his original dose, and still experiencing insomnia. This phenomenon, which we now call tolerance, was one of the first sleep-related discoveries to emerge from the widespread use of laudanum. Victorian doctors didn't understand why it happened, but they documented it meticulously. The body, they observed, seemed to become accustomed to the medicine. What they were actually witnessing was the brain's compensatory response to chronic opioid exposure, the downregulation of opioid receptors and the upregulation of systems that promote wakefulness. The ledgers from pharmacies like Thomas Farrow's reveal this tolerance pattern in stark numerical terms. Customers who initially purchased 1 ounce of laudanum per week gradually increased to 2 ounces, then 4, then 8. Some regular customers were buying 16 ounces, a full pint every week by the time their purchasing patterns ended, either through death or through some intervention not recorded in the ledger. What happened when these habitual users tried to stop taking laudanum? The answer to this question would accidentally provide Victorian medicine with its first real understanding of withdrawal and its relationship to sleep disruption. But the path to this understanding was paved with considerable human suffering, meticulously documented in medical journals and personal diaries throughout the period. Mrs. Sarah Ellis, a writer on domestic matters, kept a private diary in which she documented her attempt to cease using laudanum in 1852. She had been taking it nightly for insomnia for 7 years. Her diary entries from this period provide a rare first-person account of what we now recognize as opioid withdrawal. Mrs. Sarah Ellis's diary entry for March 3, 1852, begins with determination. "I have resolved, with God's help, to break the habit of the evening draught. My dependence upon it has become shameful, and I shall prove myself capable of natural sleep." The entries that follow chart a descent into an experience she clearly did not anticipate. March 4th. Did not sleep at all last night. This is to be expected on the first night of abstinence. My limbs felt restless and I found myself perspiring though the room was quite cool. I remained in bed with virtuous determination. March 5th. Another night without sleep. My skin feels peculiar, as though insects were crawling upon it. I find myself yawning incessantly, which seems a cruel joke given my inability to sleep. My eyes water continuously. I must look a fright. March 6th. 3 nights now. I cannot remain still. My legs ache with a deep, bone-level pain that I cannot describe adequately. I got up and walked about the house at 3 in the morning, wrapped in my shawl. The household thinks I am ill with influenza. Perhaps I am. March 7th. I took the laudanum again tonight. I could not bear it. Within an hour, I slept peacefully for the first time in 4 days. I feel I have failed some essential test of character. Mrs. Ellis's experience was being replicated in households across Britain, though most people suffered in private shame, believing their weakness to be a personal moral failure. What they were actually experiencing was the body's physiological response to the sudden absence of a substance it had adapted to. The Victorian medical community was slowly beginning to recognize this as a medical phenomenon, rather than a character defect. Though this understanding came haltingly and was often resisted, Dr. Alonzo Calkins, an American physician who published extensively on opium use, conducted what might be considered one of the first systematic studies of laudanum withdrawal in 1853. He interviewed 47 patients who had attempted to cease their use of the drug, and he documented their symptoms with clinical precision. Every single patient reported severe insomnia as the primary symptom, but the insomnia these patients experienced was qualitatively different from their original complaint. Before laudanum, they had typically described difficulty falling asleep or waking frequently during the night. During withdrawal, they described a complete inability to sleep at all, sometimes for 3 to 5 consecutive days. Several patients reported that when they finally did sleep, they experienced vivid, disturbing dreams unlike anything in their previous experience. Calkins documented other symptoms: profuse sweating, dilated pupils, rapid heartbeat, muscle aches, stomach cramps, nausea, and an emotional state he described as dysphoria, a deep unease and dissatisfaction. He noted that these symptoms typically began within 12 to 24 hours of the last dose, peaked around the 3rd day, and gradually subsided over the course of 7 to 10 days. What Calkins was documenting, though he didn't have the terminology for it, was the neurological rebound effect. The brain systems that laudanum had been suppressing, particularly those involved in arousal and wakefulness, were now hyperactive in its absence. The locus coeruleus, that region of the brainstem that promotes wakefulness, was producing norepinephrine at elevated levels. The result was a state of hyperarousal that made sleep essentially impossible. This accidentally led to an important discovery. The brain had specific systems dedicated to maintaining wakefulness, systems that could be measured indirectly through their dysfunction. Victorian doctors began to understand that sleep was not simply the absence of wakefulness, but rather an active process that could be disrupted by overactive arousal systems. The medical journals of the 1850s and 1860s filled with case studies exploring this phenomenon. Dr. Edward Headland Greenhow, in an 1862 article for the British Medical Journal, described the case of Miss A, a 31-year-old woman who had been taking laudanum for 5 years. When she attempted to stop, she experienced complete insomnia for 4 days, followed by 3 days during which she slept only in brief 15-minute episodes, waking each time with violent starts. Greenhow did something innovative. He stayed with Miss A during several nights of her withdrawal, observing and documenting what he witnessed. He noted that even during the brief periods when she appeared to be sleeping, her eyes moved rapidly beneath her closed lids, her breathing remained irregular, and she twitched frequently. When she woke, she reported dreams of falling, of being chased, of catastrophic events. What Greenhow was observing, we now know, was REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, in a disrupted form. Laudanum had been suppressing REM sleep for years. During withdrawal, there was a REM rebound effect. The brain was attempting to make up for years of REM deprivation all at once. This led to the frequent wakings, the intense dreams, and the feeling of unrefreshing sleep. This observation led some Victorian doctors to an important question. If laudanum was suppressing something during sleep, what was that something and what purpose did it serve? This was one of the first hints that sleep was not a uniform state, but rather might consist of different types or stages, each with different functions. Dr. Francis Edmund Anstey, writing in 1865, proposed a theory based on his observations of laudanum users and their withdrawal experiences. He suggested that there were two types of sleep: a lighter sleep characterized by dreams and rapid eye movements, and a deeper sleep characterized by stillness and absence of dreams. He proposed that laudanum suppressed the lighter sleep while enhancing the deeper sleep, and that the lighter sleep, though it might seem less restful, actually served some essential restorative function. Anstey was remarkably close to our modern understanding of REM and non-REM sleep. Though he lacked any way to verify his theory, his hypothesis was based purely on observational data. What happened when people took laudanum, and what happened when they stopped? The accidental experiment being conducted on a massive scale across Victorian Britain was revealing something else as well: the existence of rebound insomnia. Doctors noticed that patients who had taken laudanum for extended periods often reported that their insomnia was worse after they stopped than it had been before they started. This seemed paradoxical. If the drug had merely been treating a symptom, why would stopping the drug make the symptom worse than the original condition? The answer, though Victorian doctors didn't fully grasp it, was that chronic laudanum use had fundamentally altered the brain's sleep regulation systems. The body had adapted to the presence of the drug, and in its absence, those systems were now dysfunctional. This was one of the first hints that sleep was regulated by specific, alterable neurological mechanisms rather than being a simple response to tiredness. Dr. Norman Kerr, who founded the Society for the Study of Inebriety in 1876, made careful observations of the timeline of sleep recovery in former laudanum users. He noted that even after the acute withdrawal symptoms had subsided, after the sweating, the muscle aches, and the initial severe insomnia had passed, patients continued to experience disturbed sleep for months. They might sleep for adequate durations, but they reported feeling unrefreshed. They experienced frequent waking. Their dreams remained unusually vivid or disturbing. Kerr documented several cases where normal sleep patterns didn't fully return for 6 to 12 months after cessation of laudanum use. This prolonged recovery period suggested that the brain's sleep systems had been damaged in some way and required extensive time to heal. It was an early recognition that sleep regulation was complex and fragile, not simply a switch that could be turned on or off. Some Victorian physicians observing these patterns began to experiment with gradual reduction of laudanum rather than abrupt cessation. Dr. Leslie Keeley, working in the 1870s, developed a systematic approach. He would reduce a patient's laudanum dose by 10% each week, allowing the brain time to adjust to each reduction before proceeding to the next. His patients, he reported, experienced milder withdrawal symptoms and better long-term outcomes. This gradual tapering approach was one of the first proto-addiction medicine protocols, and it emerged directly from observations about sleep disruption. The doctors weren't thinking primarily about addiction in the modern sense. They were trying to solve the practical problem of how to help patients stop taking a medicine that had stopped working without plunging them into weeks of insomnia. The ledgers from pharmacies during this period show interesting patterns that reflect these medical developments. Thomas Farrow's ledger from 1870 shows something his earlier ledgers didn't: notations next to some customers' names. Next to Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley's name, yes, she was still a customer 23 years later. He had written, Dr. Morrison's reduction schedule. Her purchases had been slowly declining over the previous months, from 8 ounces per week to 7.5, then to 7. But what about the original question, did laudanum actually help with insomnia? The answer, discovered accidentally through mass use and careful observation, was complex. In the short term, yes, it clearly induced sleep. In the medium term, it required increasing doses to maintain effectiveness. In the long term, it created a worse insomnia than had existed originally. Yet from this accidental mass experiment, Victorian medicine learned several crucial things about sleep. They learned that there were specific brain systems that could be manipulated to induce sleep. They learned that sleep had different stages or types, some of which could be suppressed while others were enhanced. They learned that chronic disruption of normal sleep patterns could create long-lasting changes in the brain. They learned that the brain adapted to sleep-inducing substances, requiring increasing doses. All of this knowledge was purchased at tremendous human cost. The addiction, the overdoses, accidental and intentional, the babies born to mothers who had taken laudanum throughout pregnancy, the degradation of lives and families. Victorian graveyards hold countless victims of the small brown bottle that promised rest. But buried in the tragedy was genuine scientific discovery. The relationship between opioids and sleep that Victorians documented through their suffering provided the foundation for modern sleep pharmacology. When researchers in the 20th century began to study sleep scientifically, using electroencephalography to measure brain waves during sleep, they confirmed many of the observations that Victorian doctors had made through nothing more than careful attention to their patients' experiences. The question remained, though, if laudanum was ultimately destructive, were there other Victorian insomnia cures that might have worked better? What else were people trying in those desperate nighttime hours when sleep refused to come? The last entry for Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley in Thomas Farrow's ledger appears on November 18, 1871. There is no notation explaining why the entries stop, no mark of death, no indication that she moved away or found another pharmacist. Her name simply ceases to appear after 24 years of meticulous documentation. She would have been in her 60s by then, assuming she was roughly 40 when her purchases began in 1847. We might imagine what happened. Perhaps Dr. Morrison's reduction schedule succeeded, and after 24 years Mrs. Hartley finally freed herself from the small brown bottle. Perhaps she died, another uncounted casualty in the ledger of opiate mortality. Perhaps she simply moved or changed pharmacists, carrying her dependency to some other shop where a different ledger would record her continued need. The historical record, like so many Victorian lives, simply goes quiet. But while individual stories trail off into silence, the aggregate data that emerged from thousands of such ledgers told a story that Victorian medicine could no longer ignore. By the 1870s, medical journals were filled with articles about what they called the opium habit. The accidental experiment had run long enough to reveal its conclusions, and those conclusions were driving a search for alternatives. Dr. Edward Binns, in his 1877 treatise, The Anatomy of Sleep, synthesized decades of observations about laudanum and sleep into a comprehensive theory. He argued that laudanum produced what he called counterfeit sleep, a state that resembled true sleep in some respects but lacked its restorative properties. He based this on reports from long-term laudanum users who, despite sleeping for 8 or 9 hours under the drug's influence, consistently reported feeling exhausted and unrefreshed. Binns proposed that true sleep involves some kind of cyclical process that laudanum disrupted. He noted that patients who achieved natural sleep without drugs reported feeling more restored by 6 hours of that sleep than by 9 hours of laudanum-induced sleep. He hypothesized that natural sleep involved periods of lighter and deeper rest that alternated in some regular pattern, and that this pattern was essential for the restorative function of sleep. His hypothesis was strikingly accurate, though he had no way to prove it. The cyclic nature of sleep, the regular alternation between REM and non-REM sleep stages, wouldn't be discovered and documented until the 1950s, when electroencephalography allowed researchers to observe brain activity during sleep. But Binns had inferred its existence through careful attention to subjective reports and clinical outcomes. This understanding that inducing unconsciousness was not the same as producing healthy sleep represented a crucial shift in thinking. It emerged directly from the Victorian laudanum experience. Before this mass experiment, sleep had been conceptualized relatively simply. You were either awake or asleep, conscious or unconscious. The laudanum experience revealed that the reality was far more complex. The medical establishment began actively seeking alternatives to laudanum for insomnia. Some of these alternatives were equally problematic. Chloral hydrate, for instance, which we'll explore in another story, proved to be similarly addictive. But some of the alternatives that Victorian doctors stumbled upon accidentally contributed to legitimate developments in sleep medicine. Dr. Benjamin Ward Richardson, a prominent physician and public health advocate, published a series of articles in the 1870s advocating for what he called hygienic sleep management as an alternative to laudanum. His recommendations, based on observations of patients who had successfully overcome insomnia without drugs, included maintaining consistent sleep and wake times, ensuring the bedroom was cool and dark, taking a warm bath before bed, avoiding stimulating activities or heavy meals in the evening, and engaging in regular physical exercise during the day. These recommendations sound unremarkably obvious to modern ears. They're essentially what we now call sleep hygiene. But in the Victorian context, they represented a radical shift from pharmaceutical intervention toward behavioral modification. Richardson's work was influential, and his principles were widely adopted, particularly in institutions like boarding schools and sanatoriums where sleep schedules could be strictly controlled. What Richardson was doing, without knowing it, was working with the body's circadian rhythms, the internal biological clock that regulates sleep and wakefulness over a 24-hour cycle. By emphasizing consistent timing, he was helping to strengthen circadian signals. By recommending darkness and cooling temperatures at bedtime, he was aligning environmental conditions with the biological triggers for sleep. His observations about the success of these methods provided early evidence that sleep was regulated by specific, manipulable physiological systems. Some Victorian doctors went further in their rejection of pharmaceutical sleep aids. Dr. John Gunn, in his widely read 1883 book Gunn's New Domestic Physician, argued that most insomnia was caused by dyspepsia, anxiety of mind, or excessive brain work, and that treatment should address these underlying causes rather than suppress the symptom with drugs. He recommended dietary modification, stress reduction, and limiting intellectual work in the evening hours. Gunn's approach was remarkably modern in its emphasis on treating causes rather than symptoms. His observations about the relationship between digestive issues and sleep were particularly prescient. We now know that gastrointestinal discomfort can significantly disrupt sleep, and that the timing of meals affects sleep quality through multiple mechanisms including blood sugar regulation and the production of sleep-promoting Hormones, the Victorian experience, with laudanum also accidentally contributed to understanding the relationship between pain and sleep. Many laudanum users had originally been prescribed the drug for pain rather than insomnia, but had discovered its sleep-inducing properties as a secondary effect. When doctors attempted to help these patients reduce their laudanum use, they found that addressing the underlying pain through other means, heat application, massage, primitive forms of physical therapy, often improved sleep without requiring sedative drugs. This observation led to the recognition that pain and sleep existed in a bidirectional relationship. Pain disrupted sleep, but poor sleep also lowered pain tolerance, creating a vicious cycle. Breaking this cycle required treating both components simultaneously. This understanding would eventually contribute to modern pain management protocols that always consider sleep quality as a factor in treatment planning. By the 1880s, the medical literature on sleep had expanded considerably, and much of this expansion was fueled by observations derived from the laudanum experience. Articles discussed sleep stages, sleep cycles, the relationship between sleep and memory, the effects of sleep deprivation, and the factors that promoted or disrupted healthy sleep. None of this could be proven with the scientific rigor that would come in the 20th century. But the observational groundwork was being laid. The pharmaceutical industry, meanwhile, was searching for what they called a safer laudanum, a sleep-inducing drug that wouldn't produce tolerance and addiction. This search would lead to the development of barbiturates in the early 20th century, which would prove to be just as problematic as laudanum. Then to benzodiazepines in the mid-20th century, which were initially believed to be safe but proved to have their own significant issues with dependency and withdrawal. The search continues today with newer sleep medications, each generation promising to have solved the problems of the previous generation. What the Victorian laudanum experience taught us, though the lesson has had to be relearned repeatedly, is that there is no pharmaceutical shortcut to healthy sleep. Sleep is not simply the absence of wakefulness that can be induced by suppressing arousal systems. It is an active, complex, cyclical process involving multiple brain regions and neurochemical systems, all of which must function properly for sleep to be truly restorative. The small brown bottles that lined Victorian shelves offered a seductive promise. Relief from the torment of sleeplessness in 25 drops. What they delivered was temporary respite purchased at the cost of long-term dysfunction. The ledgers from pharmacies like Thomas Farrow's, with their meticulous records of increasing purchases, tell a story of desperate people trying to solve a genuine problem and inadvertently creating a worse one. But those same ledgers, read in aggregate, also tell another story. A story of systematic observation, of patterns recognized, of understanding gradually built through careful attention to what worked and what didn't. The Victorian era's mass experiment with laudanum for insomnia was a tragedy, certainly. But it was also, accidentally, one of the first large-scale pharmacological studies in history, and the data it generated, purchased with considerable human suffering, laid groundwork for modern sleep science. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley, making her twice-weekly visits to Thomas Farrow's pharmacy for 24 years, could not have known that she was participating in anything significant. She was simply trying to sleep. But her name in that ledger, repeated hundreds of times, represents more than a personal struggle with dependency. It represents a small piece of data in a larger pattern that helped reveal fundamental truths about how human sleep works, about how the brain regulates consciousness, and about the limitations of pharmaceutical intervention in complex biological processes. The Victorian laudanum era ended gradually as medical understanding evolved and regulations tightened. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 in Britain began to restrict opiate sales. Later legislation would restrict them further. The small brown bottles would eventually disappear from household medicine cabinets, replaced by other solutions, other promises, other compromises between the human need for sleep and the complexity of achieving it. But the knowledge gained, the understanding that sleep has stages, that it involves specific brain systems, that chronic disruption creates long-lasting changes, that true rest cannot be counterfeited. This knowledge remained. It was built on observations made possible by the largest, longest, most tragic sleep experiment in human history, Victorian Britain's romance with the laudanum bottle. As you lie in your own bed tonight, drifting towards sleep, you are benefiting from knowledge that was purchased at tremendous cost by people like Mrs. Hartley, people whose names appear in old ledgers and medical case studies, people who took their 25 drops each evening and hoped for rest, and who inadvertently taught us something fundamental about the nature of sleep itself. In 1829, a peculiar advertisement began appearing in newspapers throughout Massachusetts. It read, "Lectures on the Science of Human Life delivered by Sylvester Graham, wherein shall be demonstrated the natural laws governing digestion, nutrition, and repose. Particular attention given to the alarming prevalence of sleeplessness in our modern age, and its connection to improper diet." The advertisement promised that attendees would learn the path to natural and refreshing slumber through rational eating. Sylvester Graham was 35 years old when he began his lecturing career, and he had come to his theories about diet and sleep through an unusual path. Born in 1794 in Connecticut, the youngest of 17 children, Graham had experienced a childhood marked by instability. His father died when he was 2, and he was passed between relatives throughout his youth. He suffered from what he described in later writings as a constitutional weakness of the nervous system that manifested in chronic insomnia and digestive complaints. Graham attended Amherst College briefly, studying to become a Presbyterian minister, but his health problems forced him to withdraw. He spent several years working as an itinerant preacher, traveling through rural New England and experiencing firsthand the dietary habits of American farmers and townspeople in the early 19th century. It was during this period, he later claimed, that he began to notice patterns between what people ate and how they slept. By the 1820s, American dietary habits were undergoing rapid transformation. The traditional diet of the colonial period, based largely on whole grains, vegetables, and limited meat, was giving way to what Graham considered a dangerous modern diet. White bread, made from refined flour with the bran and germ removed, was becoming increasingly popular among those who could afford it. Meat consumption was rising. Sugar was more widely available. Coffee and tea had become common beverages. Graham believed these changes were causing an epidemic of health problems, chief among them insomnia. Graham's theory, which he developed over many years of observation and reading, was relatively straightforward. The human digestive system was designed by nature to process simple, unrefined foods. When people ate refined, stimulating, or exciting foods, his term for anything he considered overly flavorful or processed, their digestive systems became overtaxed. This digestive strain, he argued, caused a state of systemic irritation that prevented the body from achieving the calm necessary for natural sleep. He was particularly fixated on bread. White bread, made from refined flour, had become a status symbol. The whiter the bread, the wealthier and more refined the household. Graham found this trend appalling. The refining process, he argued, removed the most nutritious parts of the wheat, the bran and the germ, leaving behind only the starchy endosperm. This refined flour, when made into bread, was harder to digest and provided less nutrition than whole grain bread. Moreover, commercial bakers often added chemicals to make their bread whiter: alum, chalk, even compounds containing lead or arsenic. Graham advocated for bread made from coarsely ground whole wheat flour, with no additives whatsoever. The bread should be, he insisted, deliberately plain and unseasoned. No salt, no sweetening, no enrichment with eggs or butter. Just whole wheat flour, water, and yeast. This bread would be dense, heavy, and admittedly not very flavorful, but that was precisely the point. Food should not be exciting. Food should be nourishing and calming. The bread that would eventually bear Graham's name, the Graham cracker, though he never called it that, was originally developed as part of this philosophy. It was made from unsifted whole wheat flour, and it was intentionally bland. Modern Graham crackers, with their added sugar and honey flavoring, would have horrified Graham. His original crackers were meant to be so boring that they would calm rather than stimulate the eater. But Graham's dietary philosophy extended far beyond bread. He developed an entire system of eating that he believed would promote health and natural sleep. Meals should be simple and small. One should eat only 2 meals per day, breakfast and an early dinner with nothing in the evening. All food should be as close to its natural state as possible. Vegetables should be eaten raw or very lightly cooked. Meat should be avoided entirely, or if that was impossible, consumed only in very small quantities. All stimulants, coffee, tea, alcohol, tobacco, spices, should be completely eliminated. Graham's audiences were initially small. His first lectures in Philadelphia in 1830 drew perhaps 20 or 30 people, but those who attended were often desperate. Insomnia in the 1830s was a genuine torment, with few effective remedies and many dangerous ones. Laudanum was widely used but increasingly recognized as problematic. People were willing to try almost anything, even eating bland food, if it might help them sleep. One early adherent was a shopkeeper named David Camden, who left a detailed diary of his experience following Graham's dietary advice. Camden had suffered from insomnia for 8 years, sleeping no more than 4 hours per night. He had tried various remedies: bloodletting, cold water treatments, laudanum, which had stopped working for him after 2 years, and various patent medicines. Nothing had provided lasting relief. Camden attended Graham's lecture in March 1831 and was convinced enough to attempt the diet. His diary provides a day-by-day account of his experience. On March 15th, he began eating only Graham bread, raw vegetables, and fresh fruit. He eliminated all meat, all spices, all coffee and tea. Within 3 days, he noted that his digestion felt lighter and more comfortable. After 1 week, he reported sleeping 5 hours. After 2 weeks, 6 hours. After 1 month, he was sleeping 7 to 8 hours per night and feeling, in his words, more refreshed upon waking than I have felt in years. Was it the diet that helped Camden sleep? Or was it something else? Perhaps the placebo effect or changes in his routine that accompanied the dietary changes, or simply the natural resolution of whatever was causing his insomnia. Camden himself believed it was the diet. He became an enthusiastic advocate for Graham's system, writing letters to newspapers and recommending the diet to fellow sufferers. Graham collected testimonials like Camden's diary. He published them in pamphlets and presented them at his lectures. By 1833, he was drawing audiences of several hundred people. His lectures typically lasted 3 hours and covered physiology, digestion, nutrition, and what he called the laws of sleep. He spoke with passionate conviction, describing in elaborate detail how refined foods irritated the stomach lining, how this irritation was communicated through the nervous system to the brain, and how this neural irritation made sleep impossible. Graham had no formal medical training and no scientific way to verify his theories. But he read extensively: medical texts, anatomical studies, reports of dietary experiments. He synthesized information from various sources into a coherent, if somewhat idiosyncratic, system. And crucially, He paid close attention to results. When people told him that following his dietary advice helped them sleep, he tried to identify common elements in their experience. When people reported no benefit, he questioned them carefully about exactly what they had eaten. What emerged from Graham's work, buried beneath layers of moralizing and pseudoscientific reasoning, was something genuinely interesting. Systematic observations about the relationship between diet and sleep. Graham was essentially conducting uncontrolled dietary experiments on a large scale, and he was collecting data about outcomes. He noticed, for instance, that people who eliminated coffee and tea from their diets often reported improved sleep within days. This made sense. Caffeine is a stimulant, and its effects on sleep are now well understood. But Graham thought coffee disrupted sleep by exciting the gastric mucosa, not by stimulating the central nervous system. He got the mechanism wrong, but the observation right. He noticed that people who ate large evening meals tended to sleep poorly. This observation has been validated by modern sleep research. Eating large meals close to bedtime can disrupt sleep through multiple mechanisms, including acid reflux, blood sugar fluctuations, and the metabolic demands of digestion. Graham attributed it to excessive fermentation in the alimentary canal, which was inaccurate, but again, his observation was sound. He noticed that people who followed his advice to eat only 2 meals per day, with the last meal at midday or early afternoon, often reported better sleep. Modern research on time-restricted eating has found similar results. Limiting food intake to earlier in the day can improve sleep quality, likely through effects on circadian rhythms. Graham thought it worked because the digestive system needed complete repose at night, which wasn't quite right, but the practical advice was helpful. Most significantly, Graham noticed that people who followed his bland, simple diet reported not just sleeping longer, but feeling more refreshed by their sleep. They described their sleep as deeper and more natural. They woke feeling alert rather than groggy. This subjective improvement in sleep quality interested Graham greatly, and he developed theories about nerve force and vital energy being restored more effectively during sleep that followed proper diet. Of course, Graham's theories were embedded in a larger philosophy that mixed genuine observation with moral judgment, pseudoscience, and social reform. He believed that spicy foods, meat, and refined flour led not just to poor sleep but to moral degradation. He saw dietary discipline as a form of spiritual practice. He advocated for numerous health measures beyond diet: daily cold baths, hard mattresses, loose clothing, sexual restraint. His followers, who became known as Grahamites, adopted these practices as a complete lifestyle system. But what happened when people actually tried to live on Graham's bland diet for extended periods? Did it truly improve their sleep, or were there hidden costs? And what could Victorian doctors, observing the Grahamite movement, learn about the relationship between nutrition and sleep? By 1835, Sylvester Graham's following had grown large enough to support a peculiar new institution, the Graham Boarding House. These establishments, operated by devoted followers of Graham's dietary principles, offered room and board to people who wanted to experience the Graham system under controlled conditions. The houses served only foods that met Graham's strict standards, maintained schedules aligned with his recommendations, and created an environment designed to promote what Graham called physiological righteousness. The most famous of these establishments was the Graham House in Boston, opened in May 1835 by a former merchant named William Alcott, cousin to Bronson Alcott, father of Louisa May Alcott. William Alcott had been converted to Graham's philosophy after attending a lecture in 1833. He had suffered from chronic digestive complaints and insomnia for much of his adult life. After following Graham's diet for 6 months, he reported complete resolution of his symptoms, and devoted himself to spreading Graham's teachings. The Graham House in Boston accommodated 24 residents. The daily schedule was rigid and non-negotiable. Residents rose at 5 in the morning, took a cold bath, and engaged in light exercise, typically a walk or calisthenics, for 1 hour. Breakfast was served at 6:30 and consisted of graham bread, fresh fruit, and cold water. No coffee, no tea, no butter or preserves for the bread. Dinner was served at noon and included vegetables, mostly raw or lightly steamed, more graham bread, and occasionally a small portion of simple pudding made from whole grains. There was no evening meal, though residents could have fruit or graham crackers if genuinely hungry. Lights were extinguished at 9 o'clock, and all residents were expected to be in their beds. Alcott kept meticulous records of his residents' experiences, including detailed sleep diaries. These records, preserved in the collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society, provide a fascinating window into what actually happened when people followed Graham's system under controlled conditions. One resident, a textile mill manager named Robert Harrison, arrived at the Graham House in September 1835. He was 42 years old and had been suffering from insomnia for 5 years. Sleeping no more than 3 to 4 hours per night. His job required him to wake at 4:30 in the morning to open the mill, and he typically did not return home until 8 in the evening. He would eat a large dinner, smoke a pipe, and attempt to sleep, but found himself lying awake until midnight or later, then waking frequently through the night. Harrison's initial diary entries from the Graham House express considerable skepticism. The bread is heavy and tasteless. I find myself constantly hungry. The absence of coffee at breakfast is keenly felt. I cannot imagine how this deprivation is meant to improve my health. But Alcott had convinced him to commit to at least 1 month of the program, and Harrison kept his commitment. By the end of the first week, Harrison noted, "My hunger has diminished somewhat. Though I still crave more substantial food. I am sleeping perhaps 4.5 hours, no improvement yet. The cold baths are torturous." After 2 weeks, "I notice that I am falling asleep more quickly than usual, though I still wake frequently. I feel less heavy after meals. The cold baths remain unpleasant, but I no longer dread them quite so acutely." After 3 weeks, "I slept 6 hours last night with only 1 waking. This is more than I have slept in years. I cannot determine if it is the food, the schedule, or simply the removal from my usual anxieties about the mill." After 1 month, Harrison wrote, "I am sleeping 7 hours most nights. I wake feeling considerably more refreshed than I did under my former habits. The food remains monotonous, but I have grown accustomed to it. Most remarkably, I do not feel the afternoon torpor that formerly plagued me. I am considering extending my stay." Harrison remained at the Graham House for 3 months total. When he returned to his regular life and job, he attempted to maintain a modified version of Graham's diet. His later letters to Alcott indicate that he continued to sleep better than he had before his stay, though not quite as well as during his time at the boarding house. What was actually happening with residents like Harrison? Were they sleeping better because of the diet specifically, or because of the comprehensive changes in routine, environment, and lifestyle that the Graham House represented? Modern sleep science would suggest it was almost certainly the latter. The Graham House routine incorporated numerous practices that we now know promote healthy sleep: consistent sleep and wake times, morning light exposure through the early walk, physical activity, time-restricted eating with no food in the evening, and no caffeine. The specific composition of the diet, the bland whole grain bread, the raw vegetables, was probably less important than these broader lifestyle factors. But there may have been some genuine benefits to elements of Graham's dietary approach, even if for reasons he didn't understand. The elimination of coffee and tea removed a major sleep disruptor. The emphasis on whole grains provided more fiber, which we now know affects sleep through multiple mechanisms, including effects on gut bacteria and blood sugar regulation. The prohibition on evening meals meant that residents weren't going to bed with full stomachs, avoiding the sleep disruption that can come from late eating. Not all residents of Graham boarding houses had positive experiences. The records also contain accounts of people who found the diet unbearable and left after a few days or weeks. Some complained of constant hunger, weakness, and irritability. Some reported that while they fell asleep more easily on the Graham diet, they woke feeling unrefreshed and experienced vivid, disturbing dreams. One particularly detailed negative account comes from a young schoolteacher named Margaret Sutton, who stayed at a Graham boarding house in New York for 2 months in 1836. Her diary entries describe initial optimism that gradually dissolved into frustration. "I followed every rule precisely. I ate the tasteless bread. I bathed in cold water. I retired at 9 o'clock. For the first 3 weeks I slept beautifully, 8 hours each night, falling asleep within minutes of lying down. I felt this diet was miraculous. But then something changed. I began to wake at 3 in the morning, fully alert, unable to return to sleep. I felt anxious and unsettled in a way I had not felt before beginning this regimen. I began to dream intensely. Not nightmares exactly, but strange, vivid dreams that left me feeling exhausted. By the end of 2 months, I was sleeping worse than when I arrived." Sutton's experience suggests that Graham's diet didn't work uniformly for everyone, and that some people's sleep actually deteriorated under the regimen. Why might this have happened? One possibility is nutritional deficiency. Graham's diet, while providing adequate calories for sedentary individuals, was quite restrictive. The prohibition on meat meant low protein intake. The emphasis on raw vegetables while providing vitamins might have made it difficult to absorb certain nutrients. Some individuals might have been particularly susceptible to deficiencies that affected their sleep. Another possibility is that the strict regimen created psychological stress for some people. The rigidity of the schedule, the constant awareness of dietary rules, the social pressure in the boarding house environment, all of this might have created anxiety that disrupted sleep. Modern research on orthorexia, an unhealthy obsession with healthy eating, has found that extreme dietary restriction can actually worsen sleep through stress and anxiety pathways. Graham himself seems to have been aware that his diet didn't work for everyone, though he attributed failures to people not following his instructions precisely enough or having systems too degraded by previous poor habits to respond properly. In his 1837 book, Lectures on the Science of Human Life, he addressed the question of individual variation. Some constitutions, so thoroughly vitiated by years of improper diet and stimulating substances, require considerable time, perhaps 6 months or more, before the natural sleep pattern can be restored. Others, whose violations of natural law have been less severe, may experience improvement within days. Patience and perfect adherence to the system are essential. The medical establishment's response to Graham and his movement was mixed. Some physicians dismissed him as a charlatan promoting pseudoscientific nonsense. Others were more intrigued. Dr. William Andrus Alcott, a different Alcott, not the boarding house keeper, though also distantly related to Bronson. Alcott, New England reform circles were incestuously interconnected, was a respected physician who became interested in Graham's work. Dr. Alcott conducted what might be considered one of the first dietary intervention studies, though by modern standards it was quite unscientific. In 1838, he recruited 20 patients who complained of chronic insomnia. 10 were instructed to follow a strict Graham diet for 3 months. The other 10 continued their usual eating habits. Dr. Alcott kept records of their reported sleep duration and quality. According to his published results, 7 of the 10 patients on the Graham diet reported significant improvement in their sleep. Only 2 of the 10 control patients reported improvement. This seemed to support Graham's claims. However, Dr. Alcott's study had obvious problems. No blinding, no objective sleep measurements, small sample size, and the fact that the intervention group knew they were receiving special treatment, while the control group did not. Still, it represented an attempt to evaluate Graham's claims systematically, rather than simply dismissing or accepting them based on ideology. Other physicians tried variations on Graham's approach. Dr. Joel Shu, a hydropathic physician in New York, combined Graham's dietary principles with water cure treatments. He operated a sanitarium where patients followed a modified Graham diet while also undergoing various water treatments, baths, compresses, steam treatments. Shu kept careful records of patient outcomes and published case studies in medical journals. One of Shu's cases involved a lawyer named Thomas Morton, who had suffered from severe insomnia following a period of intense professional stress. Morton had been sleeping only 2 to 3 hours per night for 6 months. He had tried laudanum, which worked initially but then stopped working and left him feeling worse. He had tried various patent medicines with no effect. He came to Shu's sanitarium as a last resort. Shu put Morton on a Graham-style diet combined with hydrotherapy treatments. After 1 month, Morton was sleeping 5 to 6 hours per night. After 3 months, he was sleeping 7 to 8 hours and reported feeling dramatically better. Shu attributed the improvement to the combined effect of the diet and the water treatments, arguing that the diet calmed the digestive system while the water treatments calmed the nervous system. But here's what's interesting. Shu also carefully documented what happened when patients returned to their regular lives. Morton, upon leaving the sanitarium, attempted to maintain both the diet and a simplified version of the water treatments. According to Shu's follow-up records, Morton's sleep remained good for about 6 months, then began to deteriorate again. When Shu investigated, he found that Morton had gradually returned to many of his former habits: late working hours, heavy evening meals, coffee consumption. Even when Morton tried to resume the Graham diet, he found that it didn't work as well when isolated from the full sanitarium routine. This pattern appeared in numerous cases. The Graham diet seemed to work best when embedded in a comprehensive lifestyle change that included regular sleep schedules, stress reduction, and environmental modifications. When people tried to maintain just the dietary changes while returning to their usual schedules and stresses, the benefits often diminished or disappeared. What Graham had accidentally discovered, buried in his pseudoscientific theorizing about nerve force and vital energy, was that sleep is influenced by multiple interconnected factors. Diet matters, but so does timing, routine, stress, physical activity, and environment. His mistake was in believing that diet was the primary factor, and that his specific dietary recommendations were the crucial element. His insight, that sleep could be improved through lifestyle modification rather than drugs, was genuinely valuable. By the late 1840s, the Graham movement had begun to fade. Graham himself died in 1851 at the age of 57, relatively young and somewhat ironic given his claims about the life-extending properties of his diet. But his influence persisted in unexpected ways. The emphasis on whole grains would reappear in various health movements throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries. The idea that food choices affected sleep would be validated eventually by modern sleep research. And the Graham cracker, transformed into something Graham would barely recognize, would become an enduring part of American food culture. But what actually happened in the bodies and brains of people who followed Graham's bland diet? What mechanisms might have been at work when people like Robert Harrison found themselves sleeping better on whole wheat bread and raw vegetables? In 1849, a German chemist named Justus von Liebig published a book that would revolutionize nutritional science. Researches on the chemistry of food attempted to break down foods into their chemical components and understand how the body processed them. Von Liebig identified proteins, fats, and carbohydrates as the fundamental nutritional elements, and he proposed that different foods could be understood in terms of their chemical composition rather than their surface characteristics. This chemical approach to nutrition was happening just as the Graham movement was declining, and it provided a new framework for understanding why Graham's diet might have affected sleep, though not for the reasons Graham himself had proposed. Several European researchers, aware of the American dietary reform movements, began to investigate whether food composition actually influenced sleep quality. Dr. Friedrich Bitter, working in Dorpat, now Tartu, Estonia, conducted experiments in 1852 comparing the sleep patterns of medical students fed different diets. One group received meals high in refined carbohydrates, white bread, sugar, pastries. Another group received meals similar to Graham's recommendations: whole grains, vegetables, limited protein. A third group received high-protein meals with substantial meat. Bitter had the students keep sleep diaries and also observed them during evening study periods, noting signs of alertness or drowsiness. Bitter's results were nuanced. The high-sugar group reported feeling drowsy shortly after meals, but then experienced restless sleep with frequent wakings. The Graham-style diet group reported more stable energy throughout the day and generally good sleep, though several complained of feeling unsatisfied by their meals. The high-protein group reported good alertness and generally good sleep, contradicting Graham's assertion that meat consumption inevitably disrupted sleep. What Bitter was observing, though he couldn't fully explain it, was the effect of different macronutrients on blood sugar regulation and neurotransmitter production. Refined carbohydrates cause rapid spikes and crashes in blood sugar, which can affect sleep through multiple pathways. The fiber in whole grains slows digestion and provides more stable blood sugar levels. Protein provides amino acids that are precursors to various neurotransmitters involved in sleep regulation. Modern sleep research has revealed mechanisms that Graham never could have imagined. The amino acid tryptophan found in various protein sources is a precursor to serotonin, which in turn is converted to melatonin, the hormone that regulates sleep-wake cycles. Carbohydrates help tryptophan cross the blood-brain barrier more effectively. The fiber in whole grains affects the gut microbiome, which produces various metabolites that influence sleep. The vitamins and minerals in vegetables play roles in numerous enzymatic processes involved in sleep regulation. Graham was right that diet affects sleep, but wrong about how. His theory about gastric irritation and nerve force was pseudoscience, but his practical observations, that eliminating caffeine improved sleep, that eating earlier in the day was beneficial, that simple, minimally processed foods seemed to promote better rest. These observations pointed toward real physiological mechanisms that science would eventually elucidate. One of Graham's most interesting observations, mentioned in several of his later writings, was about dreams. He noted that people following his diet often reported a change in their dream patterns. Some said they dreamed less or that their dreams became calmer and less disturbing. Others reported that while they initially dreamed less on the diet, after several months their dreams became more frequent again, but different in quality, more natural and peaceful rather than agitated and fantastic. This observation about dreams is particularly intriguing in light of modern sleep science. We now know that diet can affect REM sleep, the stage of sleep most associated with vivid dreaming. Certain dietary components can influence neurotransmitter levels that affect REM sleep duration and intensity. The initial reduction in dreaming that some Graham diet followers reported might have been related to changes in REM sleep patterns as their bodies adjusted to a drastically different diet. The later return of dreams in a different quality might have reflected a new equilibrium in sleep architecture. Dr. Hammond Trumbull, a physician in Hartford, Connecticut, became interested in this dream phenomenon in the late 1840s. He had several patients who had followed Graham's diet and reported similar changes in their dream experiences. Trumbull asked these patients to keep detailed dream journals and record what they had eaten each day. Trumbull noticed patterns. Days when patients had eaten foods that Graham prohibited, meat, spices, coffee, were often followed by nights of more vivid, emotionally intense dreams and more fragmented sleep. Days when patients followed Graham's recommendations closely were followed by nights of calmer dreams and more continuous sleep. Trumbull published these observations in 1851, arguing that diet clearly influenced the character of sleep and the nature of nocturnal mental activity. Trumbull's work was largely ignored by mainstream medicine, but it represented one of the first systematic attempts to document the relationship between specific dietary choices and subjective sleep quality. His dream journals, preserved in the Connecticut Historical Society, provide rich qualitative data about how people experience sleep differently under different dietary conditions. One journal, kept by a merchant named Samuel Brewster over 6 months in 1849, is particularly detailed. Brewster had been following a Graham diet for 3 months when Trumbull recruited him for the study. For the next 3 months, Brewster carefully recorded everything he ate and everything he remembered from his dreams. The entries reveal fascinating patterns. On days when Brewster strictly followed Graham's diet, his dream reports were brief. Slept well. Dreamed of walking in a garden. Felt peaceful upon waking. On days when he deviated, eating meat or having coffee or consuming refined sugar, his dream reports became longer and more intense. Slept poorly. Dreamed of being chased through dark streets. Woke 3 times with heart pounding. Felt agitated all morning. Was Brewster's diet actually affecting his dreams, or was he unconsciously crafting his reports to match what he believed should happen? This is impossible to determine from historical records, but the consistency of the pattern across multiple journal keepers suggests that people were experiencing genuine differences in their sleep quality related to what they ate, even if the mechanisms were not what Graham believed. By the 1850s, Graham's specific dietary recommendations had fallen out of fashion, but his broader influence persisted. The idea that diet and lifestyle could be modified to improve sleep without resorting to drugs had taken root in American medical thinking. Other health reformers built on Graham's foundation, modifying and updating his recommendations based on new nutritional knowledge. Dr. Russell Troll, who operated a hygienic institute in New York, developed what he called the scientific health system that incorporated Graham's emphasis on whole grains and simple foods, but added more flexibility and nuance. Troll acknowledged that different individuals might need different dietary approaches. He emphasized that while Graham's principles were generally sound, they needed to be adapted to individual circumstances. Troll kept extensive records of his patients' experiences, and these records show that a modified Graham approach, emphasizing whole foods, eliminating caffeine, avoiding late eating, but allowing for individual variation in protein intake and food preferences, was more sustainable and effective for most people than Graham's rigid system. One of Troll's patients, a newspaper editor named William Garrison, not the famous abolitionist, but a different man with the same name, provides an instructive example. Garrison suffered from severe insomnia related to the stress of his work and his habit of drinking strong coffee throughout the day and evening. He had tried laudanum, which worked briefly but then led to worse insomnia. He had tried various patent medicines with no effect. Troll's approach was systematic. First, he gradually weaned Garrison from coffee over 2 weeks, replacing it with herbal teas and then plain water. Second, he shifted Garrison's eating schedule so that his largest meal was at midday rather than evening. Third, he introduced more whole grains and vegetables into Garrison's diet while reducing but not eliminating meat. Fourth, he established a consistent sleep schedule with lights out at 10 o'clock. Garrison's improvement was dramatic but not immediate. For the first week without coffee, his sleep actually worsened. This was caffeine withdrawal. By the second week, he began sleeping better. By the end of 1 month, he was sleeping 6 to 7 hours per night, compared to the 3 to 4 hours he had been averaging. After 3 months, his sleep had stabilized at 7 to 8 hours, and he reported feeling more alert and focused during the day than he had in years. What's particularly interesting about Garrison's case is what happened next. After 6 months of following Troll's regimen, Garrison felt so improved that he began to relax his adherence. He started drinking coffee again, first occasionally, then daily. He returned to eating large evening meals. Within 2 months, his insomnia had returned. He went back to Troll, resumed the regimen, and his sleep improved again. This cycle repeated several times over the next 2 years. Troll used cases like Garrison's to argue that dietary and lifestyle modifications for sleep weren't temporary fixes, but required ongoing maintenance. The body, he proposed, was constantly responding to how it was being treated. Good habits produced good sleep. Bad habits produced poor sleep. There was no permanent cure, only ongoing practice. This understanding, that sleep health requires consistent attention to multiple lifestyle factors rather than a one-time intervention, was a crucial insight that emerged from the Graham movement and its successors. It contradicted the pharmaceutical model represented by laudanum, which promised relief in a bottle. It suggested instead that sleep was an emergent property of overall health and lifestyle. By the 1860s, the basic insights from Graham's work had been incorporated in modified form into mainstream medical advice about insomnia. Medical texts routinely recommended avoiding stimulants, eating light evening meals or no evening meal at all, maintaining regular sleep schedules, getting fresh air and exercise, and choosing simple, wholesome foods over rich or highly processed ones. Graham's name was rarely mentioned. His pseudoscientific theories and moral rigidity had discredited him in medical circles. But his observations had been validated and refined. The graham cracker, meanwhile, had begun its transformation from a medicinal food into a common snack. Commercial bakeries started producing graham crackers in the 1850s, but they gradually modified the recipe to make it more palatable. Sugar was added. Eventually, the crackers became sweet enough to be considered a treat rather than a health food. Graham would have been appalled, but the name persisted. A strange monument to a man whose rigid theories had been forgotten, but whose observational insights had quietly reshaped thinking about diet and sleep. What can we take from the Graham story? Perhaps this, that genuine insights can emerge from flawed theories, that careful observation has value even when the explanatory framework is wrong, and that the path from pseudoscience to science is not always straight or obvious. Graham believed that bland food calmed the gastric mucosa and preserved nerve force. We now know that whole grains affect the gut microbiome, that fiber influences blood sugar regulation, that meal timing affects circadian rhythms, and that caffeine blocks adenosine receptors. The mechanisms are different, but the practical observations, that what we eat and when we eat it affects how we sleep, were essentially correct. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps on a stomach that's neither too full nor too empty, having avoided caffeine for several hours, your body is benefiting from insights that emerged partly from a 19th century reformer's obsession with boring bread. The science has evolved, the understanding has deepened, but the fundamental observation that how we nourish ourselves affects how we rest was glimpsed, however imperfectly, by people willing to pay attention to their experience and document what they found.